Well, hello again, and welcome to another episode of Sermon B-Sides. My name is Rusten. I'm one of the pastors here at Corinth Church, and I'm here with Pastor Jon. What's up, Pastor Jon?
Hey. It's Wednesday.
Hey, is that a new shirt?
You know, yeah, I wore it last night to class.
Yeah.
Somebody gave it to me.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I kind of like it.
It's nice.
And I was just here last night for an hour, and I'm like, and I put on this morning. It's so funny.
Well, I saw you last night, and I saw this morning. I was like, John's wearing the shirt again.
Yeah, my daughter was like,
I'm
are you going to wear that again? I was like, yeah, I only wore it for an hour.
I'm wearing the same cardigan I wore last night. Yeah.
I'm breaking some rules, but whatever.
All right.
I kind of like it.
So we just finished up the episode on Athens and talked about the historical Adam and stuff. That was pretty fun.
Yep.
We're now looking at the next scene in the book of Acts, which takes place in Acts 18, right?
Yep.
And it's Paul in Corinth, a very different city than Athens.
Yes.
I think you mentioned something very interesting that I hadn't looked at the comparison there, but I believe Corinth at this point is something like, it's like 100 times bigger than Athens or something like that in terms of population.
In my reading and research, it said that Athens was like around 10,000 people at the time that Paul visited, and the height of Corinth was like 750,000. Yeah, so it was huge. It was much bigger, and also very very different culturally. Like I kind of think of Athens as like an Ivy League, university, and this is it was
a tourist town.
Everyone wants to go there. And Corinth is not that. Corinth is like the center of commerce because where it's located, you got to go through Corinth if you're gonna, distribute your goods. Yeah. And so you've got a lot of entrepreneurs, you got a lot of business people, a lot of investing, a lot of owners. So it's just a different type of community, different place, different vibe, different feel.
So one of the things that's interesting about this events that happened with Paul in Corinth is that doesn't he connects with Priscilla, right?
Yes, Priscilla and Aquila. And
he also when he's in Corinth, correct? He's teaching at the synagogue, right? And it appears that the leader of the synagogue really likes Paul, right? Crispus.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Original, the leader of the synagogue likes Paul and is like, yeah, you can come and preach, basically. And then he pisses off some people.
Yeah, right? Crispus was a believer.
Yes. He gets baptized, I believe. Yes. Yeah. And so you have this,
and his entire household.
So Crispus is basically the pastor of this church, this Jewish Old Covenant church, and he gets converted. And now there's this conflict with Paul and this Corinthian church. Yeah. Correct?
Yeah, and there's something I've just looked at this while you were saying that. Yeah. The way that Luke records it, it sounds like Paul got kicked out of the synagogue, okay? And then he went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, and that seems to be where Crispus actually gets converted.
Yeah.
Do you see that?
Yeah, his house is next door to the synagogue.
Crispus, so, your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. This is when he's getting kicked out of the synagogue. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. And he left there, and he went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord. It's interesting how that works.
It's a really bizarre. So that's why I wanted to bring it up, because one of the things that when we were my life group was talking about this passage in this sermon, it was really confusing keeping track of all the people and names, and there's obviously a bunch of drama that happens. Yep. And he's just like, your blood be on your heads. I'm innocent. From now on, I'll go to the Gentiles, and then. Which is funny. It's like, I'm going to the Gentiles. Literally goes to the next door house.
The next door, yeah.
And it's funny because he must have been like, hey, sorry about those guys. Because he was a God-fearer living next to the synagogue. Yeah. This Titus Justus guy. Yeah. He was a Gentile worshiper of God who probably participated in the synagogue. And he basically invites him over, learns more. And then the pastor of the synagogue gets converted.
How do you think that went over?
I know, right? Because I guess it's like so the church opposes him, or the synagogue opposes him.
Yeah.
He gets kicked out. Next door, this God-fearer has him over. Crispus comes over. I don't know. Maybe he's coming over and be like, hey, sorry about that. Or I don't know. And then it turns into he believes and everybody gets baptized.
Yeah, it's a little bit
Jerry Springer-ish.
That's not what I was thinking. I was thinking Nicodemus.
Yeah.
Right? Where Nicodemus is a ruler.
Yeah.
Right? And the rulers as a whole are opposing Jesus.
Yeah.
But Nicodemus comes at night and he's
totally
curious, right? And so it kind of is a similar thing where you got the pastor of the synagogue, and the synagogue is furious with Paul, but he's like, I'm a little more curious. So he actually goes over and he gets saved.
Yes.
Gets baptized.
And then it says, and many Corinthians hearing Paul believed and were baptized. So more people believed.
More people.
And then the Lord brought, and then, so it's like after the success, Paul needs to be encouraged.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because I would have thought that would have come after your blood be on your heads.
Yeah.
Right? But after the success, he says, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I'm with you and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in the city who are my people.
Yeah.
And then it says he stayed 1 year and 6 months.
Yep.
So
not 1,260 days.
Yeah.
Not a times and a half.
Exactly. A year and a half.
Night.
A year and a half. Yes. Time.
Just a time and a half.
Yeah. So a time and a half. So you emphasized something I think that is easy to forget, and that's the humanity of Paul.
Yeah.
And the fact that this is debilitating work and it's frustrating work, and it's easy to. I think earlier I forget what chapter it is. Talks about despairing of life itself. Correct?
Yeah, it's 1 Corinthians.
It's
chapter 2, or sorry, 2 Corinthians chapter 1. For we do not want you to be ignorant, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself.
So Paul is describing his ministry and uses his experience of ministry and describes it as those terms. This Paul here, Jesus cared for him enough to appear to him in a vision and to tell him not to be afraid, and to keep your hand to the plow, basically.
Yeah, and it wasn't just don't be afraid, but no one will attack you and harm you. And so I chose to really orient the entire sermon around that.
Sure.
That sentence.
Yeah.
That experience. Because you're getting some insight into what was going on, internally with Paul. When I prepped, I went back and I was just looking at all the stories in the previous chapters.
Yeah.
Like, Paul had a really, really hard, difficult life. Like, he got run out of town. He was falsely accused. There's it's in Acts 16 where
Alexander.
Well, they're accusing him of treason, which is like he will lose his head for that.
Yeah.
So he's constantly having his character attacked. He mentions
Alexander, the metalsmith.
Yeah. Did him great harm.
Yeah.
He's been beat up a number of times. He's been beat up to the point where he's left outside the city and they think he's dead. So this is a guy, and all this is because he's preaching. That's why all of this is happening. And so I was just kind of like riffing off that a little bit and thinking about where is he at? Why does Jesus have to come to him and say, don't be afraid, no one's going to harm you? And it's because Paul was afraid. And Paul was fearful of being beat up again. And I didn't go into it too deeply, but it'd be really interesting to have a Christian counselor talk about what happens when you preach the gospel, you get beat up, you preach the gospel, you beat up. Like, certain things happen when your body experiences trauma. And I was using words like PTSD and anxiety and depression, excuse me, to try and describe where he's at, because I think most of us imagine like Paul is just this
immovable.
Yeah, immovable. And he was faithful and he was a fighter. but he was human, and he suffered, and he he talks about bearing the marks of Christ in his body.
Yeah.
I mean, scars. He had the 40 lashes minus one. There's that Paul part in Corinthians where he just goes down all these things that he had experienced. And so I wanted to kind of just acknowledge Paul was really suffering in a bad spot. And I think you just brought up something really interesting. I'm like, I'm going to say a little bit about it. It's funny that this is on the heels of what we would consider a success.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Here,
I was hoping you'd
the
talk about
ruler
that.
of the synagogue, he just believed, and his whole household got believed, and the Corinthians are hearing Paul, and he believes. And I think it's easy to go, well, why would Paul be discouraged? And I think that anybody who's been in ministry for a while knows exactly how that works.
I was gonna say,
You know?
when I brought up this success, I was like, I bet you have something to say about that.
Yeah, I think that
It's like you're waiting for the shoe to drop.
you're waiting for the shoe to drop, and the reality is that the ministry highs evaporate way quicker than the ministry lows.
Yeah.
And even while you said something earlier, and I was thinking about Elijah and going to battle with the prophets of Baal, and maybe your God is on the toilet, right? And fire comes down, and they're all slaughtered, and you're like, yeah, Elijah. And then he's
Immediately he's terrified.
he's terrified.
He runs away. Yeah.
And I think that there's something to that, that when you're witnessing God do great things, and maybe you're one of the vessels that God is actually doing these things through, there is a real dark night of the soul that accompanies success, or at least can accompany it. And I think this is a moment where you think of Paul as a brilliant philosopher, as a theologian, as a lawyer, conducting a case, and all of that's true. And he was also a human being who really struggled. And I was talking to my buddy. He was a PCA pastor and is a counselor, and we were talking about that verse, despaired of life, and it's like Paul, he said to live as Christ, to die as gain. And it's like, I think there's times where Paul is just like, take me now.
Yeah.
Like, I can't handle this anymore.
Yeah.
I think that's what it means to despair of life itself. So I really wanted to kind of just capture this moment where Paul is really struggling. And the reason was not just to know that Paul struggled, but to acknowledge, like, it's been a hell of 2 years for us, as a church, and all the stuff that we've had to navigate with just all the mandates, everything. And, there's a lot of, we were talking about our staff meeting this morning, there's a lot of people who are having a hard time right now.
Yeah.
There's a lot of discouragement. There can be a lot of anxiety. There can be a lot of fear. There can be a lot of depression. There's also, demonic stuff that goes on. And there's something comforting to know that Paul was right there.
Yeah. Yeah.
He knows exactly what that's like.
Yeah. There's a interesting trajectory that Jesus's words put Paul on too, because it seems like he's addressing something that Paul is feeling at that moment. But it's really interesting to me that promise that no one's going to harm you is also connected to him staying in this place for 1 year and 6 months.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder if Paul's like up and moving sometimes just because he's like, I got to get out of here.
Yeah.
Because almost everywhere he's at, he gets driven out, right? And so he's like, it's a little bit like, is he waiting for the shoe to drop? Is he waiting for somebody? I mean, in Athens, he ran to Athens because the Jews chased him from Thessalonica to Berea. Right. He goes there without Paul and Silas, or Timothy and Silas.
Yes.
He's waiting for them to show up, and that's when he does his sermon.
And the mob shows up. They started like
Berea.
another riot.
Yeah, in Berea. Yeah. So like I almost get the sense like, he's like, someone's gonna come, and it's gonna be We just had this fruit, and of course, the next thing that's on the itinerary, as usual, is going to be some crazy thing.
Right.
Can't put down any roots.
Right.
Can't get a breath of fresh air. Can't get comfortable. Right. But the promise leads to his ability to stay in a place for a year and 6 months.
Yep.
And it's interesting is that it still ends with a little bit of chaos.
Yeah.
But it's not Paul getting hurt.
It's not Paul. Poor Sosthenes. Not only does he have a weird name that's hard to pronounce, but the dude gets punched.
He gets punched. He gets
And
beat
Gallio
up.
doesn't even do anything about it.
Yeah.
But Gallio paid no attention to any of this.
I got really confused because I was like, wait, it says Sosthenes is the head of the synagogue. But Crispus was but I was like, oh, I guess a year and a half they had some turnover.
Yeah.
Between Crispus and Sosthenes.
Which, yeah, it makes you wonder what was going on with Sosthenes. Did he convert?
I think, based on how I read it the second time through and really thought about it, I think that was kind of like, it's almost like Sosthenes took the punch for Paul. Yeah, like he experienced, and so Paul gets relief, but he also sees a witness. It's kind of like when you're a preacher all the time and you sit down and you get to watch a sermon probably.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not up there doing that.
Yeah.
But I'm getting fed. Paul's like, I'm that guy getting punched, but that guy's getting punched for me for the sake of the gospel.
Thank you, God. Yeah.
So I think that's. I was confused. I thought for a while I thought Sosthenes was like one of the guys accusing Paul. But then if you read it, it sounds like he's, it doesn't sound like that. If it were a matter, but since it was not a matter of questions or words, names, your own law, see to yourselves, I refuse to be a judge of these things. And he drove them from the tribunal, and they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal, but Gallio paid no attention to this.
They probably didn't beat him because they agreed with him.
No, exactly. Exactly, yeah.
It was probably, he had probably,
Yeah.
Which is really funny. I mean, not funny, sad funny. Like, this is not a synagogue that you want to be leading ministry at, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't go well. Like, they run Crispus, right? He's out. Sosthenes gets punched.
Yeah, I know, and I mean, he was able to be there and minister for a whole year and 6 months.
Yeah,
and then, like, I wonder when it says the Jews, it doesn't say where they came from. Is it the Jews that just kind of finally after a year and 6 months had enough, or are these like, it's a big town, a bunch of Jews come in, like, hey, did you see that synagogue down in that area of Corinth is being all Jesus-y? No, yeah, I don't know.
We don't know.
But there's there are unique frustrations that pastors experience and unique hurts. And it's really comforting to know not only that Paul, it's not out of the norm.
Yeah.
That even Paul, this vessel of Christ to do amazing things throughout all of Europe and Asia Minor, right? All of the area. But also that Jesus noticed it.
Yes.
And Jesus addressed it.
Yep.
And Jesus spoke to him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Spoke to him and gave him a season of relief and rest and protected him. And so you see that, like, here, he doesn't get beat up. The next sermon, there's a break in patterns. I guess we'll wait till we get to that one to talk about it. But yeah, God gave him the rest that he needed, which I think is encouraging to know that, like, God knows our limitations. He's not looking at us going, oh, suck it up.
Yeah. Yeah.
He knows our frailty. We have a high priest who's able to understand us in every way because he was made like us. And so God knows the limits. He knows what he's going through. And what Paul needed was that promise. Like, you're not going to get beat up. And keep preaching.
And there's lots of
the
and there's lots more. There's a lot more fruit coming from this city.
Yes,
that's one of the promises as well.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting idea to maybe talk about a little bit there.
Let's go.
When Jesus says this encouraging word to Paul, he's not going to be hurt. He also says, "Keep teaching." Right? Doesn't he?
Yep. He says, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking, and do not be silent. For I'm with you. No one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people.
Yes. So there's a combination of like, there. One is that when he says, "For I have many in this city who are my people," right? I have many people in this city. There's two ways to read that. Is there many people in that city means don't fear because there are many of my people in this city. Don't worry about fearing because of that.
Yeah.
Or is it don't fear, keep speaking because through your preaching and teaching, there are many people who are the elect, right? Who are going to come to faith through your preaching, and you're here as my vessel to get them.
Yeah.
Do you think it's a little bit of both, or do you think it's?
Yeah, I tend to think it's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I do think that if there was a rank them 1, 2, I think this is the first, this is the second.
Yeah.
I think the first is that he's saying that there are people who belong to me, that
Yeah.
they're not going to hurt you.
Yeah.
And I think it also means, because we see Paul use this, talk about this other way, that he endures all things for the sake of the elect, right? So people are going to hear, but the promise is tied specifically to Paul not getting beat up. And I think one of the things that's fun about doing this is while you're talking about it, you have ideas. You're like, I didn't think about that. But one of the things that God is saying, that Jesus is saying to Paul right here, is that those Jews of the synagogue who are attacking you, they're not my people.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I didn't even think about that till just now.
Yeah. No, yeah.
But that ties into very much what we've been dealing with on Tuesday evenings with the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
But these people who are beating up Paul, they are, well, to this point, they've all been Jews, right?
Yeah.
But they're not.
Yeah, they're not his people.
They're not Jesus' people. There's a real condemnation in that.
Yeah, it's like the mirror. When you take a statement of Jesus and you say, well, what does that mean on the flip side? Oh,
yeah,
it means that this group of people that is beating him up are not his. Yeah, they don't have that.
They don't belong to him.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's an indictment there. But I think it is people who are going to give Paul shelter.
Yeah, yeah.
And I wonder, even while we're talking about it, is he talking specifically of Jews that are going to convert?
Yeah.
Is Crispus an example of that?
Yeah, yeah.
Right? He's a faithful Jew, and he's going to protect Paul.
Yeah. Do you think that this passage seems like it's very much reminiscent of Jesus's direction? I mean, there's certain things that remind me of Jesus's direction to like when he's sending people into the towns. Like there's certain things that come up in this passage, and one of the things that comes up in that passage is, okay, if they don't receive you, shake the dust off. And that reminds me of when Paul at first is opposed, right? And he's first hardcore opposed. It says, "Your blood be on your own heads. Yeah. I'm innocent." Yeah. And he left there and went to the house. So what's interesting is that if this is Paul kind of following Jesus' direction to, if they don't accept you, dust your feet off and move on. Mm-hmm. What's interesting is that we have an example then of Paul doing that very thing, and yet the people he dusts his feet off with and says, "Your blood be on your own head," later come around. Yeah. Or something happens where he's not completely abandoned the place. Yeah. And I think that that's a weird tension because I think a lot of people think of the dust your feet off means that we're done. And it also to everybody just sounds super unloving, right? Yeah. And as a condemnation.
Jesus would never do that.
Jesus would never do that. He's the one who said to do that. And then but Paul does, he basically says, "You're condemned. Mm-hmm. Your blood's on your head. I'm innocent." Yeah. Walks away, and then he ends up being connected to that synagogue for a year and 6 months or something.
Yeah, I wonder if what's happening is Paul's essentially pronouncing judgment on them. Yeah. Right? And he walks away, but that doesn't mean that they're not welcome to come back.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, because I guess that's how I envisioned that happening. He's leaving, blood be on your hands. And he's next door.
Mm-hmm. And then the pastor guy comes over.
And then the pastor, yeah. So it seems like maybe some of them who had rejected him.
Yeah.
Maybe at some point they had a change of heart and they start coming back.
That's what I think. I think if that's the case, then it seems like, I don't know, it just seems like we often undercut the idea of those bold proclamations because we think that they're not productive, right? But this is an example of Paul being like, you guys, blood be on your heads. I'm innocent. Peace.
Yeah.
I'm going to the Gentiles now. It actually does exactly what Paul says in Romans 11, which does it produce jealousy?
Yeah.
Where they're like, no, I want to hear
right.
this. Like Romans 11 says, he talks about how the gospel went to the Gentiles in order to make the Jews jealous.
Yeah.
And it's like we have an example of that right here. In this weird...
That's good.
You get kicked out, you go to the God-fearer next door, and then Crispus is like, what's going on?
Tell me more.
Tell me more. And then he gets baptized. So I find that really interesting. One, because of how it questions our criticisms of that kind of language.
Yeah.
Because that kind of language, I've seen it personally, and we see it here, lead to repentance. Like, I just find it sad that it should be always done from love.
Yeah.
And the desire to see people repent. But that language is just straight up abandoned for the sake of appeal, like a cultural appeal.
It's a pragmatism.
Yeah.
Like, if I say this, then they will never respond this way.
Yeah.
And so, and what you're saying is you're going to outsmart God.
Yeah.
But
what it really is if I say this, there are going to be a bunch of people who won't sit in these seats.
Yeah.
Like, and because success has been determined by that now.
Yes.
I can get more people here.
Yeah.
Ultimately, that's the goal.
Yeah.
More people. And guess what? You can get more people here if you offend less of them.
Yeah. Right.
So that's right. That's one thing I thought was interesting. The other aspect was one of the things Jesus brings up when he's sending people out is the concept of the person of peace. He says, go house to house until you find the person of peace who receives you. And then if they don't receive you, then shake out your dust. And it seems like Jesus is basically saying, there's lots of people of peace in the city.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very similar.
It's pretty cool. It's also like interesting because Corinth is a pretty bustling city too. So there's probably a lot of different kinds of people, but
there's a lot of people.
But there's a lot of people that are his. So, well, anything. I mean, we covered the whole gamut on this one. Magistrates. More magistrates.
Yes.
We didn't talk about Latin Athens. That the revelation that the Areopagus was not just a hill. It was an actual name of a council.
Council, yeah.
And so you have Paul once again in front of a council talking to these
like a school
wigs.
Board
or
something like board of commissioners or
but Athens,
city council.
So get this, Athens, out of respect for Athens' heritage and their originating democracy, they were actually not under Roman rule. They ruled themselves.
Did they?
Yes. They were an independent state.
Okay.
Basically. And that's probably why it was so small. I bet you couldn't actually get a lot of people to move there. I don't know. I didn't do any. I'm just speculating here. But I wonder if not a lot of Romans were allowed to live there because it was at this time. I believe when I studied it, I was like, wow, that's interesting. When he goes to Athens, he's basically escaping. He's outside of Roman jurisdiction.
I did not know
and
that.
So it's actually one of the testimonies to Luke's knowledge of the areas. He always refers to the political bodies by their specific political, their name that people of that city would have known them by.
Yeah.
So the Areopagus was a council name. So anyways, he's talking to magistrates there. Now he gets another opportunity to be brought before a proconsul.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's just a theme that keeps coming up.
Yeah. So, the magistrates. We've seen, we saw earlier in the book of Acts where Peter and John are brought before Jewish leaders who have a very, not just religious role, but a civic role. And they're getting beat up and ordered to do this and ordered to do that. And then this is very different because Gallio's not a Jew.
Yeah.
Right? He's just a proconsul of a region. And which really...
Like the little guy on Cyprus.
Yeah. So
Sergio Paulus. Yeah.
what I thought was interesting about this, I spent a lot of time talking about Paul's suffering. And I talked about, okay, where's the comfort in the text? And so one of them was obviously the friends that are listed and how God is bringing them around. Paul, but there's this thing that happens that is like a really big deal. So when the Jews are trying to get Paul busted, right, and they're trying to make this a legal matter, and they're trying to get Gallio involved, he hears it. He says, wait, this is about your names and words. This is not an issue.
I find it hilarious. He says names and words.
Yeah.
Names and words. This is not about laws.
No.
Yeah.
So he's like, I'm not going to rule. And that's a really important moment because if Gallio does rule against Paul, then Paul's got his hands tied a little bit as far as what he's legally allowed to do. Now, what would Paul do in that situation? That's another conversation.
He'd break the law.
But here, the Gallio rules. He's just like, I'm not going to rule on this. And what that does is the Jews can't basically bring legal charges against Paul, and Paul is free to continue traveling and teaching. And there's also this other thing that happens because Paul's not going to be in Corinth forever. He's going to leave, and that ruling that was handed down by Gallio will continue to protect the Christians who are in Corinth. Yeah. So Jews can't then accuse Christians of teaching things contrary to the law, right? And we've seen that before, how when he gets thrown in prison, and he refuses just to be let go. He wants basically the police to come and apologize because he was a Roman citizen, and he's leaving a protection for the Christians who are there, that you have the right to be here.
Yeah.
So something very similar is happening, in chapter 18 when Gallio's like, hey, no, I'm not going to rule on it. Paul's able to continue to minister, and there's basically a precedent that is set that the proconsul is not going to get involved, and the Christians who are people are coming to faith in Corinth. Sorry, my throat is going crazy. Are going to be free to worship. They're going to be free to gather. They're going to be free to preach and teach. And so there's this moment where you have a non-Christian magistrate voting justly in favor of the church. And I was trying to connect that to we need to be okay when God gives us favor and when God gives us protections and when God does stuff like that, when he does that through magistrates, when he does that through governing bodies that are not Christian. And the big thing, right now is was the Supreme Court ruling on the mandate that affects so many people in our community and a ton of people in our own church, and being really thankful for that we've seen lots of people have to navigate a really difficult time for the last couple of months, and to have their convictions and their livelihood and all of this stuff has all been called into question by both our governor and by our president. So when that decision came down, it was just relief. And that's God's favor.
Yes, yeah.
And we need to have the eyes to see that and not be afraid to give God thanks when he does that.
Now, you're saying that in part because we're living in crazy town times when Christians who might even agree that was a bad law would never publicly thank God for that good decision,
right?
Because they don't want to offend people. They're more interested in not offending people than thanking God for a just hand down.
Yeah.
And the idea of it's this weird things are tied up with I don't know, like a weird understanding of Christians and how they relate to public officials and civics and stuff like that. Like I think it'd be great for a Christian to be our, governor, right? And a real Christian, not somebody who's just like pretending to be one, right?
Right.
Because I do believe they would have a good grasp of true biblical justice.
Right.
And I would celebrate that. And there's many people who would say, "Oh, no, we shouldn't. That shouldn't even be considered. Like we shouldn't even."
Yeah.
And then that person, if he was a true Christian, would also speak clearly about stuff that is our world finds incredibly popular and affirms, but is, according to God's standards, destructive.
Right.
Like I'm thinking about the LGBTQ stuff, right? But if that politician opened his mouth about those things, that Christian politician opened his mouth to those things, but in a way that honored God, a good chunk of people who would call themselves
Christians and churches
would not support him. And would
not only would not support him, they would want to distance themselves.
They would be embarrassed by him. And that embarrassment is the opposite of gratitude to God for an honorable man in office. And so it's like that's just an example, but like there's just a trend right now for, and I honestly think it's that. It's not it's ingratitude. It's like this like cynical desire to not even see God do amazing things is almost like in the background a desire not to thank God for them.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to thank God for the things that embarrass my neighbors that don't believe in him.
You're right.
It's like I say crazy town because I think like when you really examine the motivation behind that embarrassment, I'm like, what
is that?
This is not comprendo.
Yeah, well, it's going to get, that's going to happen here really soon, in a handful of months when the Supreme Court
talks about abortion.
Is going to hand down a ruling, and the just thing to do, the right thing to do, would to be to take back Roe v. Wade. Right? That was a tragedy. It was a tragedy in what it's cost in human life. It was a tragedy of the text of the Constitution. It was unjust, and given the court, it seems like they're going to hand that decision down, and it'll be interesting to see what will happen. How will churches respond if the Supreme Court hands down the decision to roll back Roe v. Wade?
What will the church's response be? Half of the church will pretend like that ruling doesn't exist. Half of the people that call it, or too many halves. Some of the church,
one half, the second half, the third half.
Certain amounts of the church, people who call themselves the church, will condemn it, and then there will be some who will be called alt-right extremists who will celebrate and thank God for it. That's just the sad state of things.
Yeah. Don't you think something like that deserves a party?
I think it deserves a huge party.
If unfortunately, our governor is an evil man.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court is not going to outlaw abortion, but they're going to take back language about it being a constitutional right, which is going to push it back to the states, which I think is good, right? And so there's already a number of states who have laws on the books, and at the moment the Supreme Court rules that, it'll become illegal in their state. Our state is very, 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 very
liberal,
leftist.
Yeah.
And so the likelihood of us passing laws that would outlaw abortion are very little. However, I think that we can rejoice that half the states in our country are going to stand for something that's right and true and pure and God honoring.
Yes. I think that's a wonderful thing we should thank God for. And thank God for it regardless of who hates you for it.
Yeah.
It's worthy to thank him for it. He's worthy to be thanked for that.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but the tension that makes someone say, I'm not even going to thank, I don't even want to, I kind of wish they hadn't done that because then now I'm in this tension of having to Yeah. Yeah. It's a sad state. All right.
Buckle up.
Yep. Well, I think that's about time.
Yeah.
10 minutes over.
We went over a little bit.
Yeah, we got into that juicy conversation at the end. That last 10 minutes flew by.
There you go. It's always that way.
Hope you guys enjoyed hanging out with us for 40 minutes this time.
Yeah.
Until next time, trust Christ, go to church, and love your neighbor. See you guys.
See ya.